Hello, I'm Henry Londorf, the co-chair of the Greater New Haven Peace Council. Welcome to this forum. We're very pleased you could come this afternoon. We have the great pleasure of our main speaker, Eva Bartlett from Canada, a Canadian independent journalist who has spent a lot of time in Syria. The program is going to be the following. I'm going to say something about the history of U.S. enterprise in Syria and the Middle East and even more broadly around the world. I'm going to introduce Bahman Azad, who is a professor of political science and economy in New Jersey, who's on the executive board of the U.S. Peace Council, and then Eva Bartlett, who is the journalist and who has spent a considerable amount of time in Syria and in Aleppo and in the Middle East. Let me just start by saying that the U.S. Peace Council recognized about a year ago or so that the U.S. peace movement was paralyzed when it came to Syria, that the U.S. peace movement was unable to take a stand in opposing the war on Syria, and so as a peace movement it failed, and we felt that it might open things up if we were to create a delegation and send a delegation to Syria to meet with various people in Syria, leaders of various movements, and with representatives of the government, which we did. So we sent a delegation of 7 people in July of this year. I co-led that delegation with Jerry Condon, who's the Vice President of Veterans for Peace. The delegation met with lawyers, university faculty, the president of the university. We met with ministers of the government. We met with the prime minister of the parliament and other parliamentarians. We met with the President Assad. We met with women and orphans from this, widows and orphans from the war. We met with students and representatives of the student union, lawyers, members of the Bar Association. We met with members of the what we would call the Chamber of the National Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber of Industry, and we met with leaders of faith movements, the Grand Mufti and the Orthodox bishops. We spent about a week in Syria, not quite a week, mostly in Damascus, but we also traveled to 2 cities outside Syria that are Christian, that have Christian populations. One, Malula, that has a population that speaks Aramaic, and Sidnaya. And we had a chance to see some of Syria, not much. We're not experts, certainly not as expert as our speaker here, who has spent much more time. The people on our delegation mostly did not speak Arabic. That is one of the characteristics of Eva Bartlett. She does speak Arabic, and she can speak fluently with anyone she sees and has in Syria. The background of U.S. involvement in Syria doesn't start with Syria. It starts with the U.S. efforts to overthrow governments around the world. So, depending on how far back we want to go, we could start with 1953, when the U.S. overthrew the government of Iran because it nationalized oil, and made sure the U.S. government made sure that the Iranian oil stayed in U.S. and British hands. The U.S. has overthrown legitimate governments all over the world, many of them. The list is way long. In 1953, Iran, 1954, in Guatemala. We could talk about overthrowing the government of Congo in 1960, or Chile in 1973, legitimate democratic governments. And it goes on until today. Under the Obama government, in 2009, the government of Honduras was overthrown. So, what we see happening in Syria, and it is not hidden by the United States administration, is an attempt to overthrow the government of President Assad. Usually before the U.S. overthrows a government, either by sending military forces in or by using the CIA to undermine the government and to create chaos and violence, the leaders of the government are demonized. And we see this happening to a great extent with Syria. We saw it happening with Iraq. We saw it happening in Libya in 2011 when Gaddafi was demonized and then overthrown. Often there is a popular movement that criticizes or challenges the government that we're overthrowing, and that movement is taken over by CIA and related forces to create a violent opposition so that the indigenous opposition has no real say in what happens. This goes on and on. This is not something new. In the Middle East, the United States decided in the Project for a New American Century that seven countries would be overthrown in 5 years, and this has happened for the most part. Syria hasn't been overthrown yet. Iran is still on the list. We see that Iraq and Libya and Yemen and Afghanistan, wars going on, Somalia and Sudan, Arabic-speaking countries. These wars are ongoing. The United States has been at war in all of President Obama's 8 years. All 8 years we've been at war. And the goal here is to remove a government and replace it with a compliant state, a compliant government that will do what the United States needs and wants to do. And that when I say the United States, I mean the corporate interests. In the case of the Middle East, it's primarily oil and gas. I don't think anybody you need to have an explanation of the value and the importance of the Middle East in terms of oil and gas. And it isn't necessarily that they want to ship the oil and gas to the United States. The United States wants to control the oil and gas that goes to its competitors in Europe, in India, in China, in South Africa, and so forth. Having control of energy resources means that the countries that are dependent on those energy resources are, in a sense, under the thumb of the United States. So that's the background. We sent a delegation. We have opened up the conversation. We forced the conversation. We have created a coalition, which Dr. Azad will talk about, the Hands Off Syria Coalition, in order to open this up even further and make sure that the peace movement actually acts as a peace movement. I have to say that it's still a difficult road to hoe. There are too many people in the peace movement who think that international law and the UN Charter are throwaway documents, even though they become part of our Constitution and they are part of our law. And so that regime change, which is the propagandistic term for overthrowing a government, is legitimized by the United States government. This is illegal, it's immoral, it's devastating. We see what has happened to Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan, what is happening in Yemen today with these efforts to manipulate and overthrow governments. It is not up to the United States or you or me to decide that as U.S. citizens, there may be some Syrian citizens here. It's up to them and the rest of the Syrian population to decide who governs Syria. It is not up to us in the United States. It's certainly not up to our military, and it's certainly not up to our State Department. With all of that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Azad, who's going to talk a little bit about this tour that Eva Bartlett is doing and the coalition that organized it.
Is it okay if I speak sitting down?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to be cut off from the frame. Thank you, Henry. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting us and me especially. A lot has been happening since our delegation came back from Syria. There was a huge backlash. We were accused of being genocide supporters, Assad supporters, all kinds of things. And it's a vocal type of backlash, but not necessarily a big, broadly based backlash. The opposition is very limited in terms of its size, but it's very loud in terms of its voice. The majority of the peace movement is still silent. And that is what we want to overcome. And that's the main purpose. And immediately after our delegation came back and the backlash began, we thought that it is necessary for a few organizations that believe in an end to the war on Syria to pull their resources together and work together to be more effective in terms of bringing the idea of peace in Syria to the public, and especially to the peace movement. So a few of us, of course, U.S. Peace Council, National Anti-War Coalition, United National Anti-War Coalition, International Action Center, and Vice President of Veterans for Peace, who was on the delegation of U.S. Peace Council, put our heads together and see what we can do. So we agreed to put together a coalition, Hands Off Syria coalition, that would bring all our forces and resources together and act as one front for fighting for an end to this war, unjust war, criminal war anyway. It took about 2 months to come up with a statement of unity in terms of agreeing on our analysis and our demands. And it was after that original draft was prepared, we sent it to another 30 different organizations initially to get their support before we publicized it. Many of them agreed, signed on. Many of them made proposals for changes or modifications here and there. And we made those changes. And finally, when it was finally approved and everybody agreed to sign on to it, the Points of Unity document was publicized and sent out broadly to the whole peace movement, not only in the United States, but globally. At this stage, it was very well received, let me say, and at this stage, within a month, we had over 250 organizations from around the world and in the United States endorsing it. Among them is significantly World Peace Council, the Portuguese Peace Council, the Mexican Peace Council, Brazilian Peace Council. So we have a huge support internationally, as in addition to very many other organizations. But they're not just peace councils, even political parties, social justice organizations. A lot of organizations joined, and we have over 250 organizations right now, more than 500 signatures from prominent peace activists and leaders in the movement, and close to 1,500 signatures from individuals from around the world. Once we were surprised at the immediate response that we got from that, and we decided that we should start acting now in our collection of signatures. So we decided that the first step would be to start a speaking tour on Syria throughout the United States. And the idea was that we should invite Eva, who has been in Syria for a long time and actually returning from Aleppo recently. And Vanessa Beeley, another independent reporter who's a British national but lives in France, I think, to be the main speakers for our tour, along with wherever our delegation is present, members of delegation are present, they will join them. So with that, we started a tour and got the support of various organizations who had signed on to our statement to host our speakers. So it started on December 2nd in New York City, which was a very, very successful event. After that, we had a webinar, right? That was that. Wednesday following that, we had a webinar, which was attended by about over 100 people from around the world. Then we had on Thursday, Eva speak at the People's Organization for Progress in Newark, New Jersey. Then yesterday was our UN press conference that in the morning that probably many of you have seen already. If you haven't, I encourage you to see it. It was a very, very important and successful press conference. Today we are here. Tomorrow Eva is going to be in Boston. Monday she's going to be in Detroit. Tuesday she's going to be in Denver. And from there she's going to be flying to California. I think the first, on the 15th, is going to be in Oakland. On the 16th, it's going to be in San Francisco. And after that, they're working on another speech in Santa Cruz, I think. But I don't have the exact date, but probably it's going to be 18th. This is the state of our action so far. And we have received tremendous support, and we have managed to take the issue to the public and to the peace movement. Immediately after our delegation returned from Syria, organizations that were absolutely silent with regard to Syria up to that point scrambled to come up with a position statement on Syria. And it was very interesting. The debate is still going on within many of these organizations, and we are happy because that silence was deadly. At least this way we can have a dialogue, we can have a debate, discussion, and clarify the issues. And that's what we have been trying to do. And so far it's been a success, but we need your support. I don't know how many of you have signed on to the Hands Off Syria Coalition statement. I have a few copies of it here. On one side is the statement, on the other side is a partial list of organizations that we could fit in one page. So I would like to take a look at it. I just want to briefly go over the demands that we have as a point of unity. There's 4 major demands. I'm going to go over the document. 1, an immediate end to U.S. policy of forced regime change in Syria. 2, an immediate end to all foreign aggression against Syria and serious effort toward the political resolution of the war. 3rd, an immediate end to all military, financial, logistical, and intelligence support by the U.S. and NATO and their regional allies to all foreign mercenaries and extremists in the Middle East. And finally, an immediate end to the economic sanctions against Syria that is really killing people there. We are very happy to announce also that Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard has on Thursday introduced a bill to the U.S. Congress. It's called Stop Arming Terrorists Bill. And it is calling for a ban on U.S. government providing any kind of support to any terrorist organization or any organization that is affiliated with them. It's a very interesting document. And we encourage all of you to call your congresspeople and ask them to support that bill. It's an uphill battle. It's not very popular in Congress, so it needs public support, and we have committed ourselves. We have promised Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard that we will do everything we can to help pass this bill, which is a very crucial one. Thank you very much for the time you gave me. I'm going to turn it over to Eva or Henry.
Thank you, Bob. We have a clip from Vanessa Beeley. Shall we run that now?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Vanessa Beeley could not come because of Vanessa Beeley was invited along with Eva. They're two close friends doing the same thing together. Because of visa situation. Vanessa explains why she couldn't come. But, all of you know probably Europeans do not need visas to come to the United States. But since January, there is a clause added to the law and regulations, and that is unless they have tried to Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and a couple other countries. For that purpose, she had to obtain a visa, and they told her if she could get it at all, it would take 6 weeks. That's why she couldn't come. So we asked her to record a message to our meetings, and Henry is setting it up for us to listen to it. Thank you.
While Henry's setting this up, I'll just say thank you for coming out. And I'm sorry I'm wearing a coat. I know I look silly, but I'm cold. And I came back from Syria without any winter coat. So my dear friend in New Jersey took me to a secondhand clothing store, and I got this lovely thing. So it's warm. Put the hood on.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Trip to Syria. 1 week with the United States Peace Council. Good evening, everyone. My name is Vanessa Beeley, investigative, independent journalist and photographer, recently returned from a 4-week trip to Syria. 1 week with the United States Peace Council delegation, and then 3 weeks as an independent journalist inside Syria, working for some of that time with Eva Bartlett, who is a friend, a colleague, and another speaker tonight. My apologies that I can't be with you in person. It's due to the US changes in the visa regulations, which came into effect in January 2016. Basically, anyone that has visited, particularly Syria, Iran, or Yemen, since March 2011, can no longer benefit from the visa waiver program. They have to apply and go through the security channels in order to get a visa. We didn't, by the time we realized this, we didn't have the time for me to go through the various channels in order to get the visa. So my apologies. I think as time is limited, I think the main point that I want to make this evening is to reinforce the fact that from everything that I saw inside Syria, this is not a civil war, this is not a conflict between Syrians, this is a dirty war that is being waged against Syria by the United States, by the EU, by the Gulf states, and by Israel, and by Turkey, who of course is facilitating the entry of the majority of the weapons and the militant factions and the terrorist factions such as Nusra and ISIS into Syria. I think what we're seeing currently with Aleppo in particular is a lifting or a breaking through of the mainstream media firewall that has ensured that we only receive a very filtered version of events in Aleppo. And this, for me, is actually a microcosm of the mainstream media reporting on all of Syria. What I think we need to remind ourselves of, who are the forces behind our corporate media, the NATO-aligned media, who are ensuring that their narrative runs in lockstep with NATO states' agendas and objectives in the region. Of course, the investors in these media moguls and mainstream media outlets are the corporatocracy, are the ruling elite, and of course the military-industrial complex, who are heavily invested into the media organizations. And so we should not really be surprised that their agenda is certainly to maintain perpetual conflict inside Syria. But if we go back to Aleppo, what we see here, and I'm quite sure that Eva Bartlett will be able to answer any questions you have on Aleppo, as she has only just recently been back there. And what we see, in my opinion, is that Aleppo is a microcosm of how the whole conflict against or inside Syria is being portrayed both by our mainstream media and by our governments and by our NGOs, our so-called humanitarian, often state-sponsored, foundation-sponsored NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. We see basically the ignoring of the majority voice, the 1.5 million civilians in West Aleppo, in a city that has been partitioned by the invasion of NATO state and Gulf state funded militia and armed militants into East Aleppo, where they have imprisoned and held hostage probably around 250,000 civilians, the majority of whom have been held hostage, they have been imprisoned, they have been starved, deprived of the humanitarian supplies that are being allowed to enter East Aleppo by the Syrian government and its allies. The media and our governments have amplified the voices of what are effectively externally implanted militant factions in East Aleppo as being the voice of Aleppo, completely ignoring the 75%, the 1.5 million civilians in West Aleppo who are opposed to NATO intervention in Syria and who stand behind their elected Syrian government, state and Syrian army. Even if they are actually opposed to the Syrian government, they still unite behind it as the unifying factor in Syria at the moment, resisting an illegal NATO proxy military intervention. These people are dehumanized, they're described as Assad loyalists, whereas in fact this is a complete fabrication, it's a lie. Many of those people in West Aleppo do not necessarily support President Assad. However, what they do believe is that reforms, any sort of changes, any development, any evolution within the country should be pushed forward and driven by peaceful means. They don't believe in killing their country in order to improve it. So this marginalization, eradication of the majority voice in Aleppo is then being irradiated out throughout the rest of Syria, and in fact our mainstream media is completely ignoring the voice of the majority of Syrians who stand behind their elected government, the Syrian state, and the Syrian National Army and its allies in cleansing Syria of this infestation of militant factions that are not Syrian. The majority now that are fighting inside Syria, that are armed and funded by our governments, are foreign mercenaries. They are not Syrians. The most important point, I think, to make, one is that we need to resist any further escalation of violence or military intervention inside Syria, particularly the no-fly zone that we know harbors threats of an escalation of war with Russia, between Russia and the United States on Syrian soil, but also to battle against the illegal and crippling economic sanctions that amount to economic terrorism on behalf of our governments. They are not punishing anybody except collectively punishing the Syrian people for standing behind their nation in resisting intervention by our governments. I had the privilege to meet with an opposition member. She's an independent deputy. She was elected to the Syrian parliament in 2012, Maria Sada. She's a Syrian citizen, she's a woman, and she's a Christian. And in her address to the UN in June 2016, she made the very clear case for the fact that US and EU sanctions are effectively economic terrorism and are having as devastating an effect as the armed and military terrorism that is being inflicted or imposed upon the Syrian people. And I would like to just put across the points that she made, because I think rather than hearing my voice, it's important to hear the voices of the Syrian people, and particularly of the representatives of the Syrian people, the internal unarmed opposition, not the external armed opposition, that are demanding the intervention of completely despotic monarchies such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia in order to impose an Islamist government that is not wanted by anybody in Syria. Syria is all Syrian people, all factions, all sects, all areas of society want to remain living in a secular state. They do not want some sort of extremist Islamic state imposed upon them. So I will leave you with Maria Sada's words to the UN. We, the Syrian people, do not want any state to speak in our name. We have the right to decide and choose our destiny. The opposition is a legal structure inside the parliament and not outside the country related to foreign agendas. We want to start reform by involving all Syrians working together in partnership with the institutions of the state and not by killing each other. Democracy means a certain level of political culture. It is not something that should be created by war. The existence of state is our existence, so we are all responsible for saving our state. These words are the words that I heard echoed by almost everybody that I spoke to in the various areas of Syria that I visited, whether they were religious leaders, whether they were members of parliament, whether they were members of the unarmed opposition, whether they were just civilians in the streets, whether it was in West Aleppo, whether it was in Damascus. This is pretty much what I heard. And I think that we as a peace movement, as journalists, as independent activists, these are the words that we should be supporting, and I know that all of us here this evening will be supporting. So thank you for listening to me again. I'm sorry I can't be with you, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the evening. Thank you.
So, Eva, did you want to play a clip or you just want to start it?
I do want to play a clip, but I want to say some words first. So I don't know if we can switch the thingamajig over, the table. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll make a few points while we're setting that up. Yeah, I mean, I obviously fully agree with everything that my colleague Vanessa said. Actually, I just want to make a few comments. Henry was speaking about very truly that too many people think that we can just, ignore the UN Charter when it comes to countries, sovereign nations like Syria or Libya. And in fact, even within the UN structure itself, they think they can ignore the UN Charter. And I make this point because, the next point that I want to make, and that is the Syrian Arab Republic in the UN should be called the Syrian government. And yet repeatedly hostile nations like America, the UK, and its allies call it the regime. This is not the legal terminology, and this is actually not legal in the UN. And yet the UN permits it, even though Syria's permanent representative, Dr. Bashar al-Jafri, has time and again said, this is not legal. You have to abide by the tenets of the UN. So, this is one point about the UN. There's many other points to make about the UN and how, when it comes to Syria, the rules of the UN do not apply as it does to other countries. For example, many resolutions prior to this one that Congresswoman Gabbard is introducing on the preventing of sales of weapons, of funding to sales of weapons to terrorists, of funding to terrorists. These are already existing it's wonderful that she's introducing this legislation, but it does already exist in prior UN resolutions. 2253 is one of the more recent ones. I believe it was December 2015. And yet it's been ignored because it's not convenient to what the Western imperialist nations and their allies want to achieve in Syria. Another point I just wanted to make, I just want to just give you a bit more background on who I am, why you may or may not want to, consider the words I have to say. Henry did mention that I've been to Syria a number of times. I've been there 6 times now. The last time I was there for 1 month, of which I went to Aleppo twice. Once for 3 days, and I'll get into this later on, and another time for a week, actually, entirely. So it gave me many good opportunities to see things that are important with regards to elements to do with Aleppo. The other thing is that on my prior visits, for example, this summer, on journalist visas that I applied for and paid the visa for and waited for the visa for, I spent 2 months in Syria this summer, so I was able to travel quite extensively and talk with a lot of people. And just the other point I'm going to make is that, as Henry mentioned, the U.S. Peace Council met with people, across the board of all faiths, of all, kind of political backgrounds within the government, civil society, and regular people. Likewise, in many months in Syria, I've also done the same. So I come at this really wanting to give you an accurate picture of what the Syrian voices I've been meeting and hearing from over the years have been saying. And with that, actually, I'm going to play, hopefully, is it working? I have to work it. Okay. I'm just going to play a short clip. Sorry. This, in theory. Okay. Go ahead. What you were saying, your situation in Aleppo.
Here in Aleppo, we face this every day. Here in Aleppo, we face.
Right on the camera.
Okay, wait. I've never done it.
Let's take that camera footage down, right?
Yes.
All right, take the cursor, put it over the camera, put down that.
Where's the camera?
It's going to be all the way on your left-hand side.
Oh, no, that's a special editing program. Thank you. Anybody else a technical expert here?
Can we copy that to Henry's?
Actually, it's showing my computer. So I did not show.
No, you have to tell him to use a different output for the video. You have to tell the computer.
Okay, it might not work. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Then you have to go to the control panel and select the screen first.
Is that what you wanted or not?
I don't know.
Whoa! That's amazing. Thank you. Guy's a magician. All right. So obviously this is a woman I met in Aleppo. We were on the University of Aleppo campus. And just some context, the residences of the University of Aleppo There are 20 of them, and 16 of these residences have been for years housing internally displaced Syrians from other areas of Aleppo, therefore areas of Aleppo that had been, or well, at the time that I recorded this, were occupied by different terrorist factions. So according to the people that were telling me about these residences, they house over 10,000 IDPs from other areas of Aleppo.
Homes every day, but we have very power to live here, and we have how can I express for you the feeling? We can't leave our city here. We can't leave our city for these people which they want to take our lands, which they come from out of our country. They want to kill us. They want to take our country. We can't leave this. Really, I can't hold any arms to fight with army or something else. But I can fight when I stay in my home, when I stay in my city, when I try to change anything bad. But as you see, the situation is very bad.
You can't take arms, but do you support the army?
I support the army because he defends for our country.
Now, we're in the university area where there's residences for displaced people. Are you living here?
No.
No?
No. I'm living in a place which you can call it in the face of this which Al-Nusra. My home in the face of the building of them.
What area?
City Dawli.
Alhamdulillah, salam.
Every day, some children they killed by sniper. Every day, a lot of people killed by bombs. Every day by Jarrah al-Ghaz. Every day, but we're still there and we're still living there, and we want to live there. We don't want to leave our country because these people are not Syrian. These people they have the money to kill us and to take our money and to take our city, but we are not going to leave them.
Anyway, so I wanted to share that with you because her words about not wanting to leave echo the words of Syrians I've met everywhere. Unfortunately, the truth is many Syrians have been forced to leave, either through fear of this violence of which she spoke or due to the criminal Western sanctions on Syria, which have devastated Syria's economy. And that is one of the reasons that there are external refugees, people leaving Syria to find work, to send money back to their families. And, you know, aside from the many months I've spent in Syria, I've also spent many months in Lebanon while waiting for visas to return to Syria. And in Lebanon, because I am an activist and an independent writer, I don't have a lot of money to spend. So I was always kind of hopping around trying to find a cheap place to stay. And so I traveled quite a bit around Lebanon, staying in hostels, etc. And I met Syrians from all over, in various places all over Lebanon. And without exception, they all wanted to be home in Syria, and they hadn't left due to the government. Now, I will say I met some in Beirut who supported this notion that there was a so-called revolution, but they are the minority, and I did not meet very many of these. The most people I met, and this includes within Syria, do not support this concept that there was a revolution, and they didn't flee the government to Syria, but they left because they wanted to be able to support their family. So that's just a point I want to make. One other thing I just briefly want to address. I was mentioning the UN, and we were all speaking about the different means that governments have used to try to destabilize Syria or topple the elected government. And just yesterday, my government, the representative of Canada at the United Nations, introduced a draft resolution that unfortunately was passed, but not without a fight. And this resolution was supposedly the cessation of all combat, this is how they phrased it, activities in Aleppo, but with no mention of extracting the terrorists in Aleppo who've been hounding and plaguing the people, the 1.5 million that Vanessa mentioned, maybe even more than 1.5 million people, on a daily basis for years. And even recently, even though there have been significant developments in Aleppo in terms of restoring stability and peace, those terrorist factions, within pockets they still occupy, continue to send rockets and mortars onto the civilian areas of Aleppo. And so if you're reading news from Aleppo, every day there's 7, 8, 9, 10 civilians who are being killed by these rockets, and many, many more injured. So this legislation that my Canadian representative, who does not represent me, introduced at the UN General Assembly was a sort of response to the Russian and Chinese veto of a Security Council resolution. And this veto is notable for a few reasons. Number one, the resolution itself was also put forth to basically enact another cessation of hostilities at a time, as I just said, when there have been significant developments in the restoration of peace to Aleppo. And when I say significant developments, I'll say this. Since mid-2012, Aleppo has been occupied by different terrorist factions, from the so-called Free Syrian Army to Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, to other affiliates like Ahrar al-Sham, Nuruddin al-Zinki, and other terrorists that, incredibly, the U.S. still calls them moderate rebels. And I do mean it incredibly because, for example, Nuruddin al-Zinki beheaded a 12-year-old Palestinian boy a few months ago. And you can see this gruesome video on YouTube if you can bear watching it. It's atrocious, and it's not the first of its kind, and not just by al-Nusra, or in this case Nuruddin al-Zinki, but also by the so-called moderates of the Free Syrian Army. So at this point in time, when now 93% of Aleppo areas that had been occupied by terrorist factions for years have been resecured, and this is just in the last week alone. This is significant news. And at this point in time, when these measures, which are actually going to bring real security and real human rights to Syrians, when this is happening, the usual coalition of US, America, Britain, etc., want Syria to stop fighting terrorists in Aleppo. And so they wanted to impose another ceasefire. And I think people should understand, if you weren't aware, that Syria and the Russians, their allies, did actually adhere to ceasefires in the past, in February and more recently in September. Both ceasefires were notable, but let's just go back to the September one, the most recent one. With that one, Syria and Russia did agree to the tenets, which was to cease hostilities against all terrorist factions except the ones like al-Nusra, the ones who were on the U.S. and the Western terror lists. On the other hand, from the very beginning, the 20 main terrorist factions said, we're not going to participate, and they didn't, and they continued to violate the ceasefire, and by the end they had violated it at least 300 times, killing over 160 Syrian soldiers and over 60 civilians. And it wasn't just they who violated it, but it was also the U.S.-led coalition who violated it. When on September 17th, I believe it was, they attacked a Syrian army position in Deir ez-Zor, eastern Syria, for almost 1 hour, repeatedly striking with airstrikes this position, also with helicopter attacks, and killing at least 83 Syrian soldiers. The U.S. administration and spokespeople later wrote this off as accidental, or it wasn't us, or again accidental, or collateral damage, or oops. They did not apologize, they did not accept responsibility, and the fact is it was a premeditated attack on these soldiers, and it enabled ISIS, who the U.S.-led coalition is allegedly fighting, to take over this position. And just today there's news that perhaps in Palmyra, one of the most historic sites in the world, I can't confirm what's happened, but there are reports that maybe ISIS is taking over or is attacking. I did go to Palmyra this summer, and the road there, it's an alternative road. At points, I was told as we drove that ISIS was only 3, 4, 5 kilometers away, so it's entirely possible they might have attacked, seizing the opportunity when forces are busy defending Syria elsewhere. So the point being that this resolution that the U.S. that Russia and China vetoed, they had very good grounds to do so. And so now this recent General Assembly resolution that was unfortunately passed, introduced by the Canadian delegate, the purpose is solely to vilify the Syrian government in Russia. And just keep that in mind, because when I get into the reactions of people who are being liberated, the reactions of the Western governments is because they don't want to accept the fact that Aleppo is being liberated and the people are happy about it. I'll just briefly go over some points about Aleppo. So I mentioned that since mid-2012 it's been occupied by terrorist factions. Vanessa also mentioned that the media, when it speaks of Aleppo, it's generally speaking of eastern areas of Aleppo that were occupied by terrorist factions. So the greater Aleppo area that the media has ignored, they've ignored the fact that these civilians have endured long periods of sieges, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer, when terrorists have cut off the only road leading into Aleppo, which was the Ganasa road, which is the road that I traveled up. So that's a road that is east, significantly east to the main highway, the main highway is not usable. It goes through areas terrorists occupy in Idlib. The only other access highway at that point was this Ganasa road. So when it was cut off, this meant the people of Aleppo were under siege, denied food, denied medication, anything that was coming into Aleppo, which was everything they needed. So this was never a point that the corporate media raised because it didn't serve the agenda that the corporate media serves. Other things that most media won't talk about is the fact that these daily bombings, these terrorist bombings. Now, you might not have heard the woman in the clip say it, but she was talking about bombings. She said jarat ghaz, gas canisters, a very simple means of terrorizing people. The terrorists manufacture bombs by taking local gas canisters that everybody uses for cooking and stuffing them full of explosives and shrapnel, bits of metal and glass, probably mostly metal, and firing it on the civilians. They have varying sizes. They fire them with something called hell cannons, and the larger sizes are water heaters, made into bombs the same way, and those are called Hell 2. They're even more powerful and can do more damage. But even smaller mortars can do significant damage in terms of killing people. They might not knock down a building, but one single mortar can kill 5 to 10 people. And this is what people have been enduring for years, to deaf ears of Western leaders, human rights groups, and media. The other thing that is not very much highlighted but is critical to Syria is that since 2011, the people of Aleppo did not participate in this so-called revolution. But in mid-2012, it was brought upon them when terrorist factions invaded and took over different districts. With the presence of these terrorist factions, they have thieved thousands of factories from the industrial hub of Syria, which was Aleppo. They've thieved these factories or destroyed them, but mostly thieved. Then they've taken the machinery, including massive, large machinery that have to be transported by trucks on highways and into Turkey. And this is with the complete approval of Turkey's leader Erdogan. And so this is obviously this is an attack on Syria's industry. And I think there's been little to no condemnation of this by the UN or by Western leadership. Now, when I went to Aleppo, I was interested mostly to talk with people and get a sense of how they've been living. And so they did tell me about the daily terror bombings that they live with, the difficulty of living in a city where electricity and water have been cut off for years because both the electricity plant and the water pumping stations were in areas occupied by terrorists. So to compensate for this, the Syrian government and different aid associations, local aid associations, charities, had dug something like 300 wells. And people drinking water from those wells, some of them were getting sick because not all of this water was drinkable. Some of this water was contaminated, and the people didn't have the means to actually purify it. The other point being, without electricity, people have been relying on what they call ampers, generated electricity, which those who can afford to buy the amper, running a couple of bulbs, a television, a refrigerator, whatever their means and priority. Other people couldn't afford to do this, and they've been actually living without electricity for years. So these are significant impacts on their quality of life that we don't hear about. The other things now, I'd like to get into some of the mythology that has been bantered about regarding Aleppo in corporate media. Now, we were talking about how the Syrian government has to be vilified, and the Syrian army, in order for the Western public to support the idea of a no-fly zone in the name of human rights, right? So a no-fly zone because this vile, vilified leader, we must go in and save the people of Syria. This is the idea. And so in order to make their elected president, who they overwhelmingly support, look like a monster that we need to depose, there have been very many myths put forth to confuse people and get them to support no-fly zones. So one of these myths is that the Syrian government is starving its people. And this has been a myth around Aleppo in recent months, and prior to Aleppo, in other areas like Madaya, like Yarmouk, and like areas that have been either liberated, like Homs and Homs, or Daraya was another area that's recently been secured. And always, these myths don't have a basis. There may be starvation, but the cause is not the Syrian government. And I'll give you some concrete examples. Madaya is an area outside of Damascus. It was inhabited by Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, and another terrorist faction whose name escapes me at the moment. In January of this year, there was a media frenzy with literally every corporate media on their websites or on their front pages screaming about Madaya and screaming about the number 40,000 starving civilians in Madaya. But 3 months prior, the International Committee of the Red Cross spokesperson had said, we, with the assistance of the Syrian government and the United Nations, have sent in enough food aid and basic supplies to last the people of Madaya for many months. So October, November, December, suddenly in month one, after enough supplies to last several months, everybody's starving, according to corporate media. There's something wrong with this story. If the Red Cross spokesperson can verify that the aid has gotten in, what's happened after? Well, when another shipment of aid went in around mid to late January, and a journalist with Russia Today went in, and Syrian journalists as well, and were interviewing people, they were saying, the terrorists stole our food. The terrorists are selling our food at rates we cannot afford. And when they say that, it's like 3, 4, 5 times the rate of what the food was. So the problem being there is food, but not for the people. It's for the terrorists. And this is something that happened in Yarmouk, and even when food aid was trying to come in, again by the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, there are many instances you can see online documented with terrorist factions firing on these aid convoys trying to bring food in, or simply preventing it from entering. During the September cessation of hostilities that I mentioned just a little while ago, terrorist factions in eastern areas of Aleppo actually said, we don't want aid and we're going to prevent it from entering. So now let's fast forward to the current situation where 93% of Aleppo has been, eastern areas of Aleppo have been liberated. This is the numbers have been going back and forth, but the Russian Ministry of Defense has said now it's 93%. So what we've seen in recent reports coming out of there, both we've seen the testimonies of people saying the same thing that they said in Madaya and Yarmouk and other areas, the terrorist headquarters, in which you can see stockpiles of medicine, stockpiles of food, stockpiles of weapons, stockpiles of chemicals used in weapons. So there are many, this leads to the next myth. I was going to say there's many contradictions in what the media has said and reality, because the next myth that the media has used to vilify the Syrian government and army is to repeatedly over the years say the Syrian army has used chemical weapons on the people. And I think one of the more notable examples people might remember was the accusations of sarin gas having been used. And in fact, the Syrian government invited UN inspectors to come into the country, and they did come in, and they did their investigation, and Carla Del Ponte of the UN said, all fingers point at the rebels of using sarin. And then you have Seymour Hersh's article titled Who's Sarin, in which he traces how sarin went through Turkey and was delivered to the so-called rebels. This is 2013. Fast forward to September this year. Since January, since April this year, as with allegations of starving civilians in Madaya, since at least April, there have been allegations of bombing hospitals in Aleppo, and it's been to the extent that newspapers have even used photos of a hospital that was destroyed in 2013 by al-Nusra by truck bombings, and this hospital is named the Kindi Hospital, and it was the biggest and best cancer hospital in the Middle East. So it was destroyed in 2013, but media have this year said it was destroyed by the Assad regime in East Aleppo. The hospital wasn't in East Aleppo and it was destroyed 3 years prior. the media is lying that blatantly. They even, they're not accurate within their lives. Some will say there's only a few remaining doctors. Some will say there's 10 remaining doctors. Again, they're only ever referring to Eastern Aleppo, and their stories contradict one another. But again, as Vanessa pointed out, the greater Aleppo area is completely ignored. There are over 4,000 doctors in greater Aleppo. And these doctors are working to treat people with normal ailments, but also treat the people that are being maimed by terrorist bombings on a daily basis. In terms of hospitals being hit, the fact that maternity hospital was hit on May 3rd and 3 women inside were killed was completely obliterated from, or eliminated from, corporate media headlines, because this hospital was in greater Aleppo and it was hit by terrorist bombings. There have been other hospitals attacked, and Professor Tim Anderson is a good person to look to on this. I highly recommend, for people who genuinely want to understand what's happening in Syria, his book, The Dirty War in Syria. It's available at globalresearch.ca. And he met with the Ministry of Health, who then, it was early 2016 or so, he wrote this article saying 2/3 of Syria's national hospitals have been attacked by terrorists. So this is a very significant number, 2/3. It was something like 41 of 94 have been attacked by terrorists. Yeah, it was 41 of 94. So to just touch on a few other issues, sectarianism. So the woman in the clip, you might have guessed, is Sunni Muslim, and all of Aleppo itself is predominantly Sunni Islam. And yet the corporate media would have us believe that this situation in Syria is about Sunnis rising up against an Alawi dictator, according to their version of events. Well, the army is populated by Sunnis. Aleppo is predominantly Sunni, and they stand behind their government and their army. And wherever, as Vanessa said, wherever one goes in Syria, you find people speak, and maybe it was Henry that said this as well, you find Syrians identifying by their nationality, not by their sect. And they reject sectarianism. And I can't begin to tell you the number of times people have told me, Eva, I'm Christian, I used to share my Muslim friends' holidays, or vice versa. Mufti Hassoun, who's the Sunni leader in Syria, he regularly goes to churches. He leads Easter Mass and sometimes. And President Assad, who is himself Alawi, he will go to Sunni mosque, or he will go to churches. This whole sectarianism doesn't exist in Syria. It's thrust upon Syrians by Saudi Arabia and Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar. Yes. So one other thing I want to address is the white helmets. Have you heard of the white helmets?
Yes.
How many people? Can you raise your hands? Wow. So that's more than, I think there was nobody in Aleppo who's heard of the white helmets. That's rather important, because the white helmets purport to be working in Aleppo. So if they're busy saving lives, and there's now been over 100,000 people from eastern areas of Aleppo liberated, and these people have been living under terrorist rule for 4 years, and the white helmets have been saving them, why haven't they heard of them? It's because the white helmets are a construct of the West, founded by a British ex-military officer, funded by America, funded by EU, funded by UK and other nations, to now well over $100 million. So these volunteers, these neutral rescuers who like to carry arms and stand on the dead bodies of Syrian soldiers, and who like to sit children with head wounds down in an ambulance without administering any sort of oxygen or therapy to shock, as with the case of Amran, if you're aware of what I'm referring to, they are another example of the propaganda that's being used against Syria. Again, if they purport to be working in Aleppo, why has no one heard of them? And where are they now? 93% of these areas have been liberated, and we don't see any white helmets. So I think that people have been they're very effective. People have been very confused by these videos put out by the White Helmets, and by the fact they were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. This is a way to try to legitimize them, but the fact is they are not neutral, and they aren't working in Eastern Aleppo. They might be in Idlib, we have yet to see, but I highly doubt that. But these are one of the sources that the corporate media is relying on. The corporate media relies on the testimonies of white helmets, or as they call themselves, Syrian civil defense, as word as what's happening on the ground in Aleppo. They aren't in Aleppo. But there is a Syrian civil defense, and they are volunteers. They don't accept bribes from foreign nations. And their work is handicapped by the fact that terrorists in eastern areas of Aleppo, now liberated, had stolen most of their vehicles and equipment. And they don't have funding from the West. And the Western sanctions have crippled their means to get proper equipment. But these are the actual real Syrian civil defense. Other things I just want to touch on are, so in Leiramun, which is one of Aleppo's industrial districts, the so-called Free Syrian Army had a presence there, their 16th Brigades. And when I was there in November, I visited a building which 3 stories down housed a prison they had made up with solitary confinement cells, about 9 of them, smaller than phone booths. But the point is that this was 3 stories below ground. The building had been attacked by aerial strikes because the Syrian army is waging a war against terrorism. Below ground, everything was intact. So what I drew from this fact is that one can be a few stories below ground and survive from aerial strikes. So does it not surprise you that in areas where terrorists are and where they're firing onto civilian populations, these areas, the buildings are going to be physically battered? This is obvious. This is warfare. In greater Aleppo, the buildings may not be as destroyed, but in the last 5 years, 11,000 civilians have been killed. Civilians and not armies. Civilians alone have been killed by terrorist bombings. And this is according to the head of forensics in Aleppo. Just in terms of recent developments, amongst the areas liberated and amongst the people who, again, over 100,000 people now, civilians, including women and children, who've been evacuated, there have been at least 1,000 militants who've left. And 953 of these, obviously these are Syrian, not some of the over 100 foreigners, 100 states, I should say, not just 100 foreigners, but foreigners from over 100 states. So the 953 who have laid down their weapons and taken the amnesty offered by the Syrian government are Syrians. And this is not a new trend. For years, Syrians who, for whatever reason, money, bribery, being threatened by militants that they have to take up a gun and fight, for whatever reason that they did take up weapons and fight, the reconciliation trend has been growing over the years. And I believe that Henry met with the reconciliation minister, as I did in 2014. And the fact that Syria established a reconciliation ministry and is willing to pardon Syrians who took up weapons and fought not only against the state but against the civilian population, this fact alone is very telling, because it does show, among other facts, that the Syrian government is striving for a political solution. And this story that the Syrian government is just thriving off of killing its own civilians is complete nonsense. Again, with almost 1,000 Syrians in these areas laying down their weapons, because they could. There are humanitarian corridors. They could take the option to not lay down their weapons and to continue on to Idlib and join other terrorists. This is an option, but these people have chosen to lay down their weapons. So this is very telling. On the note of those humanitarian corridors, on November 4th, I was at 2 of them, the Bustan al-Qasr corridor and the Castella Road corridor. This was a day, again, in which the government and the Russians were trying to enable civilians to leave the areas occupied by militant factions. But as with prior days, at least one of these corridors, the one I was at, was shelled twice while I was there and 5 more times after I had left. The terrorists within do not want people to leave. I mean, now the situation has changed, thankfully, but they were holding people hostage. And these are the civilians who have left can testify to this. I met some civilians from Al-Halak, which is north of an area called Bustan al-Bashar. Both are in eastern areas of Aleppo. Both were occupied by terrorist factions. When I met them on November 10th, and they told me 20 days prior, they and about 40 others had managed to flee. They seized on the moment when there was some fighting between the Syrian military and terrorists within, and they seized on the confusion and contacted the Syrian army and saying, "We're coming out, please help us to escape." They spoke of the conditions of terrorists hoarding food, of them themselves only being able to get rice and bulgur and whatever they could find, but not meat and not life-sustaining food. They also spoke of trying to escape 2 times prior and being prevented by the terrorists. You can see videos online of terrorists firing on civilians who are trying to flee. So clearly, I can't remember who put it, but this was the largest hostage crisis in recent history, or perhaps in history. And thankfully now it is the situation on the ground has changed. I'd like to note the hypocrisy not only regarding the lack of condemnation of the killing of 83 Syrian soldiers, or even more, it might be over 100, but also the recently of the targeted shelling of Russian medics in Aleppo. Even the ICRC didn't condemn this, and this is, had it been a reverse situation, of course the whole world would be condemning this. And finally, Vanessa was speaking of Aleppo as a microcosm of Syria, and I would agree with her in that we've seen, in terms of the media lies and the vilification campaigns, the same things we see in Aleppo have been used, as I mentioned, the starvation accusations, the slaughtering its own people accusations. Even now, when people are fleeing to greater Aleppo, to the security of those areas, the BBC, New York Times, The Guardian, all the major players, Democracy Now!, are actually stating the opposite. They think that the public is that dumb. They're stating the opposite, even though there's countless testimonies online of Syrians saying, we fled the terrorists and we want to be here, and thank you, Syrian army. So if you're looking at these sources as credible, remember, they're not only relying on the white helmets as their source, they're also relying on the single man in the UK, Rami Abdulrahman, who runs an organization, a one-man organization called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and who he himself gets his information from the white helmets and from activists who remain unnamed. So the whole concept of getting information all the time and consistently from unnamed activists, it's not credible any longer. I have met people who say, for example, the family I met did not want to use their real name because they still had relatives in eastern areas of Aleppo. But I've also met people who said, I have no problem using my name because I stand with my country and I'm not afraid of the repercussions. So if I were to always quote unnamed people, I would lose credibility. But on the other hand, if I say the names of the people and where they're from, that gives me a valid source. This is what the corporate media does not have, valid sources. They do not have institutions on the ground. They do not have NGOs on the ground in Aleppo. Well, now eastern Aleppo is largely secured. But all these times, all these years, when they've been saying 270,000 or 300,000 starving civilians in eastern areas of Aleppo, where are they? Now, if over 100,000 people have come out and Aleppo is 93% secured, really are another 200,000 or 170,000 in 7% of these areas? No, it's not possible. So the lies that we've been told over the years are manifold. But I think bottom line, Vanessa cited one of these internal opposition members, and I've also met with internal opposition members in April 2014. But the bottom line, Anna, you said Syria hasn't been overthrown yet. You were referring to the Project for a New American Century and their intention to overthrow all these governments. I don't believe Syria will be overthrown. I believe, unfortunately, there will be more bloodshed because while Congressman Gabbard has put forth, this new is trying to put forth this new legislation to prevent the U.S. from sending more weapons. Obama apparently still has agreed to send 200 more soldiers or something like that, or send man-pads to terrorists, freedom fighters who like to behead children. I believe, unfortunately, there is going to be more bloodshed. But by and large, it doesn't serve the Syrian people. And all these Human Rights Watch, all these organizations like Human Rights Watch, whose leader is totally compromised. Number one, it cannot be an independent human rights group if you're constantly calling for the overthrow of a government. Number two, he's not credible. He tweets videos of Gaza and he says this is Aleppo. He tweeted a photo of Aleppo, which had been attacked by ISIS, and said it was Aleppo attacked by Assad's forces. He is not credible, and Human Rights Watch receives funding from the State Department. They are compromised, and yet, just like with the White Helmets, and just like with the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, these are the sources that our media are relying upon when they're citing all these supposed crimes of the Syrian government.
On the other hand, the Syrian people stand behind their army and their government. Not every single one of them, obviously, but the majority do. I met a group of people. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go with them. These are young women and men volunteers who cook food and take it to soldiers in the front lines. So not only are they volunteering their time, but they're risking their lives to take food to soldiers on the front lines, where they themselves could be shot at or killed. And they're doing this because this is how much they believe in the army. And pretty much everybody I met said, Eva, the army isn't this monolithic thing. The army is the Syrian people. It existed prior to President Assad. It's called the Syrian army, the Syrian Arab army. It's not called Assad's forces, just like the Syrian government isn't called the regime. So I just hope that you would take to mind, or consider that a lot of the media, a lot of the talking points you've been told come from compromised sources who maybe haven't even been to Syria in the last 5 years, and certainly don't have the interest of Syrian people, of their human rights and of their freedom, if they're going to send terrorists who imprison women and who kill children and destroy the civilization and their culture. This is not about human rights and democracy. It's quite clear. I'm frankly very surprised that people still fall for this after what we've seen with Libya and Iraq and other areas where the imperialists wanted to intervene, and they did intervene. In Syria, I really hope that that it's a different picture, because it's nearly 6 years now and Syria has not fallen. So that's all I really have to say, if you want to open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Eva. I could add some of my own experience, but I think that maybe it will come out in the questions rather than taking up more time now. We started late, and with the three of us, it's taken a while. I think it's very important information. So please ask questions. Let's see where this goes. Yes, please.
Thank you for your
Microphone.
Yeah, please.
Why don't you do that? So that everybody can hear you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. I must say, such a brave presentation as well, because we are living in times where a lot of people's views are being compromised. This is going to be a bit of a technical question on something that you mentioned earlier. I was watching the United Nations General Assembly conference yesterday, and saddened to hear and see about what happened. My question is, what are the implications? Because I wasn't quite clear as to what will happen now on the ground, and I think that's very important. I know that the Syrian government was not happy with the outcome, and I believe so were a lot of people who were following what was going on. So could you please enlighten us as to what the consequences of that decision are?
I think the answer about what the consequences are depend on what U.S.'s actions are. I mean, clearly the decision for the Syrians, whether they want to cease actions against the terrorist factions, that is their decision. It's their sovereign right to fight terrorism. It depends if the Western interests want to push things, and I mean, if they want to try to impose a no-fly zone or actually attack Syria, then this is very serious, and it's going to be something that it's not just Syria responding, but it's allies that were invited to help defend Syria. I actually think that this was more meant as a way of trying to vilify Syria, but I don't really know if there's going to be any actions that follow in lines with trying to force a cessation of hostilities. I can't really speak to that. I can't surmise. I feel it was more to do with trying to vilify the Syrian government and Russians. But is that something you want to speak to, Henry, or anyone else about that particular question? No?
Other questions? Sure.
I'm just wondering what you'll be doing.
This is being recorded. Please come to the microphone. Thank you.
Sure. I'm just wondering what you folks will be doing to inform people around the world and how you're marketing this and how you're telling people and how you will in the future tell people what's going on there, so more people become aware and active in this. Thank you.
You have your own way, right?
Yeah.
Well, in the coalition, as I mentioned, we have more than 250 organizations from around the world that are working with us, in fact. Immediately after we created our own Hands of Syria coalition in Germany, several organizations got together and immediately created their own Hands of Syria coalition in Germany. So they are in communication with us, and we have been exchanging information, and we are planning some global action. Hopefully, we're discussing that right now. Hands of Syria action, international action, after the inauguration. We are hoping to create a big mobilization around the world on that issue. You wanted to say something?
No, that's fine.
Yes. I want to ask a question. I did watch that segment on Democracy Now! Recently, and I think Vanessa Beeley made a commentary on it. But so a person was there from the Syrian American Medical Society, I believe. I don't remember his name, but one of the peculiar things that he said was that he spent time in there. He and his associate had not seen any al-Nusra there in Aleppo in the time they spent. And I was just wondering, if you were spending a lot of time in Aleppo, could you be around there and not notice the presence of al-Nusra? I mean, are they hiding? Are they disguising themselves? Are they, would you know? And I guess that's the main question.
I didn't see that Democracy Now! In question, but I mean, if he was referring to Greater Aleppo, I could see his point. I mean, did he actually say he'd been to eastern areas occupied by so-called rebels?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. So I mean, I find it implausible. It seems like he's lying. Even the United Nations said, I mean, they downsized their number at some point in recent months. They said, we think it's only 9,000 al-Nusra. But even they acknowledge that al-Nusra is there. I mean, you cannot pretend al-Nusra. They have videos. They have videos saying they're there. They have Twitter saying they're there. They're proud of the fact they're there. And the Syrian civilians that have left say they're there. So this person was lying. That's all I can say. But I don't know. You saw the segment in question? Do you have anything to add? Yeah? No? Okay.
No, I mean, it was obvious.
It was obvious that they are trying to present the other side only. That was clear.
Yeah, I mean, but that's been systematic with Democracy Now! I'll just add one aside. Democracy Now! Purports to be balanced and investigative, yet they only host people that support this narrative. They haven't had any real critical thinkers on, to my knowledge, let alone anybody who's recently been in this area or Aleppo. They could have had both Vanessa and myself on, for what that's worth. And they were asked by people, many people, repeatedly. It's not like they didn't get the message. I know clearly they got the message, but they didn't want to have Vanessa or myself or other people who've been to Syria recently on.
When we decided to have, when Eva arrived in New York, several members of the coalition, Hands of Syria Coalition's leadership from various channels tried to contact Democracy Now! And actually our proposal was that if you do not want to just present the opposing side, which is us, at least we suggest a debate format to bring one of your guests that you have had so far and have our side present also, but no response.
Let me just add that after we came back from Syria, I was interviewed by WBAI, which is one of the founding stations that Democracy Now! Is on. But still, Democracy Now!, which has over 1,000 outlets, has refused to provide any information from anybody who takes an opposing view to the U.S. State Department. Democracy Now! Is shameless in this. I'm not afraid to say that, and I like Democracy Now! And I like a lot of what they've done. But in this situation, Democracy Now! Has refused to present any information